In the latest two episodes of Station 11, alongside Kirsten coming face to face with the Undersea and David, she also finds herself confronting the truth when it comes to what Jeevan hid from her when she was a child. In terms of characters introduced this episode, there's Saeed, who's been around for a while, but like many people part of the Traveling Symphony, he hasn't really said or done much, so there was no need to really take note of him, but it does seem that him and Kirsten have some type of relationship, and I'm not sure what exactly it is, but it does seem that Saeed has some expectation to have some type of realm of influence over Kirsten, especially considering the events of what happens in episode 6. So in episode 6, it's pretty much dealing with the aftermath of what was assumed to be an attack orchestrated by David. So what we see is Sarah mourning Gil because, even if they had their issues, they were just starting to finally reconcile, and now he's dead. So she's mourning. She's also dealing with the fact that her glasses were broken, so now she can't really see that well. And you add on that Alex was assumed missing, and then Kirsten's off somewhere. It's a lot of things to go through at one time. But thankfully we learned that Alex got thrown off of Kirsten's horse Lily, or was it Leela? One of the two. And she just ended up being with Katrina all night crying and, talking. And Kirsten learns this later on, but even with her learning that Alex is okay, with her seeing a bunch of graves set up for the members of the Traveling Symphony, as much as Saeed may run after her and try to stop her from pursuing David in the Undersea, she goes anyway. And it's kind of weird her meeting the Undersea, mainly because on top of it being a bunch of children, they're also weirdly trusting of her, just because she knows the prophecy mentioned in the Station 11 graphic novel, and she even gets so far as to get to meet David and get close enough to him where she could have slashed his throat. But with him mentioning the Museum of Civilization, and even having a note which alludes to what we get to see, which is Brian and one of his associates having guns and pretty much forcing Sarah and the rest of the troop to the Museum of Civilization. So comes Kirsten being willing to work with him being David, because she gets the vibe that maybe he's not big evil. But the truth is, as she's traveling with David toward the Museum of Civilization, they get attacked by red bandanas. So there's a good chance that rather than it being David who's the problem, it might be the red bandanas who have been the real threat all along. Though I should note, when it comes to that whole kids with minds to their chest things, that apparently was one of the Undersea children's ideas. Not David's, but apparently when he's away, or if he ever gets taken out, those children will fulfill their role as the Undersea. A rebel will come amongst them and try to destroy the adults. But totally different thing. What matters right now is this episode ends with Kirsten, David, and the rest heading towards the Museum of Civilization, getting attacked, and alongside one of the members of David's Undersea being killed, and David rolling downhill because Kirsten pushes him. Kirsten gets surrounded about 4+ men, and she gets poisoned. But despite what we see in episode 6, Kirsten somehow takes out everybody in episode 7. Yes, she is poisoned, but it seems, as we see 8-year-old Kirsten walk out there, the antidote was on one of the red bandanas, so she gets it, but it seems somehow 28-year-old Kirsten ends up back at Frank's apartment, and while there, she seems to confront everything she knew about what went down as an 8-year-old. And with that, we get to understand why Frank and Jeevan had the relationship they did, or maybe the lack of relationship they did, as well as why Jeevan and Kirsten left. So to make a long story short, before we're introduced to Frank was a journalist who was a war correspondent, seemingly. He went to Sri Lanka, and while there, he got attacked, perhaps, or he stepped on a mine. It's not clear specifically what happens. It might have been that he got set up. Either way, he got blown up, as he would say, and ended up with shrapnel in his hip, which makes it so he now uses a cane. And also, it seems after that attack, he kind of became a little bit skittish about leaving the house or really doing what he used to do. So now he ghostwrites, and it seems ghostwriting is hell for him. I'm talking about the kind of hell where he was taking heroin, which he got from who knows where, in order to deal with this new life that he has set up for himself. Now, as for his relationship to Jeevan, as you can kind of see at this point, Jeevan is the least successful of his siblings. And it seems, even though Jeevan means well in what he does, and like his family seem to want to help people and kind of like do something out in the world, while Jeevan gets props for going to Malaysia after Frank was attacked in Sri Lanka, he also did that on Sia's dime, which might be how he owes Sia $18,000 or something like that, based off of what we heard in episode 1. But since then, it's not clear what Jeevan might have done besides live out in LA doing who knows what, possibly paparazzi, who knows. All that's known for sure is that his relationship with Sia was probably strained after that huge expense, and his relationship with Frank probably was strained just because of lack of interaction. So, of course, Jeevan showing up with Kirsten and expecting to stay there while the flu pandemic went down wasn't necessarily Frank's idea of a good time when Sia told him that's what he's going to do. But in time, it seems they kind of chipped away at whatever issues they had. And not just for the sake of Kirsten, who of course is going through her parents being dead and all that, but it seems, you know how distance for many, you know how they say distance makes the heart grow fonder for many? I think when it comes to Jeevan and Frank, the distance is what made them kind of cold toward each other, yet being in close proximity. At least for Frank, it helped. With Jeevan, he still has his anxiety and his neurosis, which kind of messed things up a little bit. But I think by the time we get toward the end of the episode, they've reached a place of understanding that makes it so they can be brothers and truly love each other again. But no sooner does that happen, Kirsten decides she wants to do a Station 11 play. Jeevan decides he wants to start exploring outside the apartment, and this sets up a gentleman. I don't think I should call him a gentleman considering what he does, but a person comes into Frank's apartment while Kirsten's Station 11 play is going down, stabs Frank because he refuses to leave, while Jeevan is like, let's go, because we was already planning to anyway. And Frank dies. Kirsten's in the closet, where she has herself holed up. Jeevan kills this man, and Kirsten is led to believe that Frank didn't die at the time, but instead he held up in his room because he didn't want to say a proper goodbye, and that's what she lived with all this time. However, with visiting Frank's apartment in modern times, she realizes as a 28-year-old woman, as she sees Frank's skeleton in his room, that Jeevan, as he had done so many times before, protected her from the truth just because he felt it was the best thing that he could do as her guardian. So in terms of highlights, we only have 2. The first one is the Prophet returning to the Museum of Civilization. As we know, David, aka the Prophet, is actually Tyler, who is Elizabeth and Arthur's son. It's been about 10 or so years since he started the Undersea, and it's not really clear what he did the 10 years before that, but just taking note of all that happened when he left, and which includes him creating the Undersea, possibly creating the Undersea to fight off the Red Bandanas, and now him coming back as this quote-unquote prophet with this cult child following to the Museum of Civilization, where, based off of previews, we know that at least Clark and Elizabeth are still alive. It's going to be interesting to see how those people react with each other, especially since the main reason David is even going to the Museum of Civilization is not to help Kirsten and her family, aka the Traveling Symphony. It's because that huge gaming device that he downloaded stuff on, he wants that back. And whether or not it's to erase all of what came before, or whether or not it's maybe because he has a copy of Station 11 on there so that he can have a copy once again, it's unclear why he's going besides to get that item. But what we do know for sure is that the likelihood of him just sneaking in through the tunnels, going up to a tower and getting his device and leaving is slim to none. Especially when you consider if his kids are crazy enough to strap mines to their chest and blow up an adult who they probably knew and loved, imagine what they're going to do to a bunch of strangers who their leader has painted as bad people. And speaking of that, I kind of wonder, which is another part of this highlight, how is Kirsten going to react based off of how David talked about the Museum of Civilization? Because thus far, Sarah has definitely pushed him off, and you can assume that Kirsten, thinking that Sarah knows what she's talking about, probably has a bad point of view when it comes to Museum of Civilization. So adding David's cosign to it, even if he is a bit off and crazy, it doesn't explain that he's from there. It does make you wonder, when she goes into it, while she, yes, is happy to see all of the traveling symphony, how will she react to their rules? How will she react to their past if David tells them? And overall, when it comes to the next crop of episodes, I have to admit I'm quite interested to see how Seven City Airport evolved into the Museum of Civilization. The second highlight deals again a better understanding of Jeevan, Frank, and Kirsten. When it comes to Jeevan, I feel that we've kind of got a better sense of how his family saw him. For when it came to seeing the first episode, he just seemed like a slacker or someone who borrowed a lot of money from her to try to pursue his dreams. But I would say with the way that Frank paints him, yes, there's a strained relationship between the three siblings when it comes to Jeevan, but at least you can get some sense of idea that yes, he used Sia's money, possibly without permission, or to go see Frank, who was injured in a hospital in Malaysia, but you can see there's a bit of a balance. Yes, Jeevan may not be as successful as his siblings, but at the very least, when it comes to who he is, you can consider him a good person. And maybe not a good person who has the kind of productivity which makes him as notable as Frank, or as much of an asset to society as Sia, but he has some type of value, for lack of a better term. And then in terms of Frank, besides learning that he died, I feel that we also got to understand who he was as a person as well. For aside from the highlight that Sia noted with him winning a Pulitzer Prize, I want to say, we also learned that he was somebody who wanted to illuminate people when it comes to what's happened in Sri Lanka, and yes, he paid the price for that. But I think one of the things that I feel that we really learn when it comes to Frank is maybe how Jeevan became who he is. For we still don't really know who Jeevan was before that play, outside of how his family saw him. Because right now his girlfriend is just somebody who's mentioned sporadically, but as for how those two got together, what she saw in him, considering how his siblings talk about him, it's pretty much unknown. Yet, with Frank, I feel like maybe Jeevan had a similar trajectory where maybe he was becoming something, but then something happened to him, which is why he has such a high amount of anxiety, and also why when things really start to get tough, mentally he starts talking to Sia as if she's alive and there, which was kind of weird, but also, as shown, Jeevan was probably going through a bit of a mental breakdown, and Sia was the person he went to when it comes to his troubles. Which leaves Kirsten, who, in one of the past episodes, you seeing Kirsten kind of seeing herself mirror what Jeevan said to her growing up. I feel like her need to confront what was the truth and not Jeevan's version of the truth that he fed to her was necessary. For in doing so, you got to, I think at that point, maybe you can see Kirsten kind of shedding that layer of herself, and not in a bad way in terms of shedding her childhood, but more so shedding, living a lie and even pursuing kind of inventing that for Alex in a way, so that Alex may possibly be somebody who is more so fearful about the outside world, and that's why she stays with the Traveling Symphony, rather than creating the kind of environment where, yes, Kirsten may have her issues with abandonment and scared for Alex going out there, but at the very least, she may make it so that, while Alex may have permission and the ability to go out there, she'll at least want to come back. And I think with her addressing who Jeevan is beyond this hero that she saw, maybe, just maybe, she's seen him as a full human and maybe giving herself the allowance to be the same instead of strictly focusing on being his protector. In terms of on the fence topics, there's really only one, and that's just trying to understand how Kirsten survived. Now, it's noted that Kirsten is definitely a badass, but one of the things we haven't seen yet in this season is what kind of training does she have? Because when she left Frank's house, that's when she gets that knife, and we haven't really seen her gotten to train or learn how she defended herself, or considering she notes that she killed multiple people, there's always that question of, okay, how? Were you just lucky at the time? Did somebody teach you how to fight? Because even at the cabin, Jeevan is not teaching her how to handle a knife, how to handle a gun or anything. So at what point did she become so talented with a knife that she pretty much became not only known for it, but also considered a potential protector when it comes to the Traveling Symphony? Because even with that kind of talent, she was poisoned by a dart, and she was going against like 3 or 4 people. So unless it was one of those situations that we see in action movies where they just make a circle to keep you from getting away, and each one just took one swing at her at a time and she took them out one by one, I'm just trying to figure, how did this person handle 4 red bandanas who, based off the way we're told about them, on top of being meth heads, they were also heavily militarized, which and also included veterans. So a lot of stuff doesn't make sense in terms of Kirsten's survival.